Some cases don't stay unsolved because investigators miss something. They stay unsolved because everyone thinks they already understand them. From the outside, Dana Satterfield's murder looked like the kind of case that should have resolved itself quickly. The scene was contained, the timeline was narrow, witnesses existed, physical evidence was recovered, and almost immediately, the human instinct kicked in. The need to name the danger. People want certainty more than they want accuracy. And when certainty feels close, patience disappears. In the days and weeks after Dana was killed, suspicion didn't move randomly. It moved predictably toward the nearest relationships, toward details that sounded damning when stripped of context, toward explanations that felt emotionally satisfying even when they weren't legally sound. And that's where this case began to fracture, because there's a difference between what feels obvious and what can actually survive a courtroom. In 1995, investigators weren't chasing theories. They were navigating limits imposed by the law, by technology, and by the reality that evidence doesn't get louder just because time is passing. Some of the most important pieces of this case were already sitting in evidence lockers, preserved and cataloged, but legally untouchable. That silence, the gap between knowing and proving, created a vacuum. And vacuums never stay empty. Rumors filled it, assumptions hardened, alternate narratives took root. The longer the case remained unresolved, the more people rewrote it in their minds. Not because the facts changed, but because waiting without answers is unbearable. This episode is not about what happened inside the salon. We already walked that night. This episode is about what happened after. When a case that felt close slipped just out of reach, and when doing nothing was mistaken for failure. It's about why acting too soon would have destroyed any chance at justice. Why evidence can be powerful and still unusable. And why in this case, the most dangerous thing wasn't a lack of clues. It was the belief that the story was already finished. Because Dana Satterfield's case was never unsolved. It was just waiting. Hey, Angela, how's it going tonight?
Hi, John. It's good. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, really no complaints.
So I'm trying very hard not to overthink what you didn't tell me before we started this.
So that's honestly perfect, because this episode works best if you're reacting in real time. Episode 2 is one of those chapters where what isn't happening matters just as much as what is.
It's already ominous and slightly unsettling.
Yeah, this is the part of the story where things feel like they should move forward, and they don't. And people tend to get uncomfortable with that.
I can relate. Silence makes people fill in the gaps where they should not.
Exactly. It's our instinct. And, we have a need to fill the gaps. It's a huge part of what we're talking about tonight.
All right. So I'm ready to sit in this uncomfortable part, I guess. I might have to grab the bear.
Well, you have the bear. But that's good, because before we get into it, welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue, the podcast where we unravel the shadows of the human mind and dive deep into the mysteries that haunt small towns and big cities alike. I'm your host, John.
And I'm Angela. And together we shine a light on the stories that keep us up at night, unsolved disappearances, lives stolen way too soon, and the questions that refuse to be buried.
So tonight we're continuing our 3-part series on the murder of Dana Satterfield. If you're just joining us, episode 1 walked through the night that Dana was killed, the setting, the crime scene, and the immediate aftermath. That episode established what happened and why. At first glance, it felt like the case should move quickly.
But it didn't.
No, it didn't. And that's not because investigators stopped caring or because evidence disappeared or because the case was forgotten. It's because this is one of those stories where the difference between knowing something and proving it becomes the entire obstacle.
So this isn't a recap episode.
No, and it's not a years go by montage either. This episode is about perception, how cases get framed in the public mind, how assumptions take hold, and how dangerous it can be when a story feels obvious before it's actually provable.
Which is something we've seen a lot, especially with other cases.
Absolutely. And in Dana's case, the evidence was never gone. It was preserved, cataloged, waiting. What was missing was an effort. It was a legal doorway that hadn't opened yet.
It's a really important distinction, especially for listeners who assume silence equals failure.
Yeah, exactly. So tonight is about that silence and why investigators sometimes have to hold their ground and do less instead of more, and about how communities, families, and even entire narratives shift when answers don't come fast enough.
So we're looking at what happens after the crime, but before the justice.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. This is the space between, the part of the story where pressure builds, theories multiply, patience runs out, even though the truth hasn't changed.
All right, so a gray area, and that gives me chills in a very specific way.
Yeah. But before we go any further, we do want to take a quick moment for a few housekeeping things, not because we like saying it, but because it genuinely helps.
He likes
We do?
I said he likes saying it.
It does genuinely help the show reach people who care about these stories. So if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Amazon or any of them, iHeartRadio, we're everywhere. Leaving a review or a rating helps push Dark Dialogue into the recommendation feeds. It tells the algorithm that this isn't just background noise. It's something that people are engaging with.
And if you're watching on YouTube, hitting the thumbs up, subscribing to the channel, or ringing the bell really does matter. And I'm going to say it again, it's free. Those actions help the platform understand that long-form, thoughtful storytelling has an audience. And that's how episodes like this reach beyond our existing listeners.
So that does bring up something. We've had a lot of engagement on YouTube lately, which is freaking awesome.
Love it.
A listener, Dark Side of the Moon 2348.
Nice.
Who, is really engaged, seems to like all our episodes, leaving comments and stuff. And so freaking thank you. That's awesome.
Yes.
So
whoever you are.
And it's,
thank you.
There's been some fun talk on there on some of the cases and stuff, and some engagement and stuff. It's cool to see. It's exciting. It's really awesome. So
I always like when people have information that we didn't have and want to share it with us.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really freaking awesome. And, when we're talking about this, we don't ever want to be like salesy about it. It kind of drives me nuts even bringing it up. But the reality is that visibility helps keep these cases alive. It helps keep these stories out there being told, and that matters. And especially for stories that spent years waiting to get heard. So it really does help.
Yeah. So I think the tone is now set, John.
Yeah, I agree. So tonight is not about spectacle. It's about restraint, patience, and the cost of misunderstanding a case before it's finished. So with that mindset in place, we can talk about the case everyone thought that they understood. So there's a moment that happens in almost every violent case, and it happens quietly. It's not announced, it's not written down, and it doesn't wait for evidence. And that's the moment people decide internally what kind of a story they think that they're hearing. Not investigators, people, listeners, neighbors, coworkers, the broader community. It's the first explanation that the brain reaches for, so it doesn't have to sit in uncertainty. And almost always, that explanation is familiar, contained, emotionally manageable. When a woman is killed, especially in a place that's tied to her daily life, the human instinct is not to ask what's least likely. It's to assume the danger came from somewhere already inside her world. And honestly, statistics have shown us that there's a reason that our brains go there.
Yeah.
And it's not because that assumption is malicious, and it's not because it's careless, but because it makes the threat feel smaller. If the violence came from a familiar relationship, then it doesn't spill outward. It doesn't require the rest of us to rethink how safe ordinary spaces really are.
Exactly.
It allows the horror to stay boxed in. And that instinct matters in this case, not because it was wrong to examine, but because of how quickly it became the story that many people stopped questioning. And here's the important distinction. That story doesn't need to be spoken out loud to shape everything that follows. Once an assumption takes hold, details stop being evaluated on their own. They start being interpreted, assigned meaning, bent to fit a narrative that already feels settled. Delays stop feeling procedural and they start feeling suspicious. Silence starts feeling intentional, and patience gets mistaken for inaction. What's dangerous about that isn't emotional discomfort, it's legal consequence, because investigators don't move on the speed of belief. They move on the speed of proof. And proof has rules that don't care how obvious something feels. And in Dana Satterfield's case, investigators did what they were required to do early on. They examined the nearest explanations thoroughly and uncomfortably. And when those explanations didn't hold up under scrutiny, they did something that often gets misunderstood. They let them go. But the public story didn't move with them. And that's where the fracture begins, because once people believe they already know the answer, any lack of resolution starts to feel like avoidance rather than restraint, like failure rather than caution, like something is being protected rather than preserved. And that misunderstanding followed this case for years, and not because evidence was missing, not because the investigation stopped, but because the case entered a phase where the most important thing law enforcement could do was not force an ending that couldn't survive court. And in the mid-1990s, that balance was even more fragile than it is now. Science was slower, databases were limited, and legal thresholds were unforgiving. So when this case moved out of the initial shock phase and into something quieter, it didn't go cold. It became misunderstood. And once a case is misunderstood, the real danger isn't that people stop caring. It's that they start demanding the wrong kind of resolution.
So even when investigators are still actively working, that silence creates pressure that they can't safely respond to?
Exactly. And that pressure from the outside becomes its own obstacle, because the system doesn't exist to satisfy certainty. It exists to survive cross-examination. And in Dana Satterfield's case, the evidence that mattered most was already there, preserved, cataloged, waiting, even though the law wasn't ready to let it speak yet. That's the tension that we're stepping into now. And it's not a lack of effort, and it's not a lack of care, but a case caught between what people believed they knew and what actually could be proven. So one of the most persistent myths in true crime is that evidence speaks for itself. We talk about DNA as if it's a voice, as if once it exists, it automatically points at a person and demands an arrest. We talk about fingerprints like they're fingerprints on a movie screen, glowing and conclusive the moment that they're found. And we talk about witnesses as if seeing something means understanding it. None of that is how real investigations work. Evidence doesn't speak. Evidence has to be introduced. It has to be authenticated. It has to be legally connected to a specific person in a way that survives court challenges. And in the mid-1990s, that process was far more fragile than most people even realize. So by the time Dana Satterfield's case moved past the initial shock of discovery, investigators were not staring at an empty board. They were staring at a board full of information: fingerprints, biological material, witness observations, timelines, all of it carefully documented and preserved. What they were missing was not effort. It was a lawful bridge between what they had and who they believed was responsible. That distinction is the difference between knowing and proving. And it's the reason this case did not, or could not, move the way that people expected it to. In 1995, forensic science already carried enormous weight in courtrooms. DNA was not brand new. It wasn't experimental. Jurors were understanding it as powerful and almost definitive, but what most people didn't understand, and still don't, frankly, is that DNA isn't useful on its own. DNA is comparative. It tells you whether two things match. It does not tell you who someone is unless you already have a lawful sample to compare it to. And in Dana's case, biological material was recovered and preserved early. That mattered enormously, but the existence of that evidence didn't magically unlock the identity of the person who left it. There was no nationwide, fully populated database capable of instantly naming an unknown offender. CODIS, as people think of it now, did not exist in a meaningful operational sense. State databases were limited, entry requirements were narrow, and if a person had never been arrested for a qualifying offense, their DNA simply wasn't there to be matched. And I mean, it's still that way. You know, now we have these genealogical databases where we've talked about them. You can opt in for that, but there's still no legal way to get DNA without a court order.
Yeah.
You know, it was even more that way in the 90s. And investigators were left with a paradox that frustrates the public, but is painfully familiar in law enforcement. They had evidence that could exclude people quickly, but not evidence that could identify someone without crossing legal thresholds. So when people ask why DNA didn't immediately solve this case, the answer isn't negligence, it's the law. There's another misconception that creeps into unsolved cases, and that is the idea that charging someone is better than charging the right person later.
Right.
And that mindset has ended more cases than it's ever closed. If investigators had pushed forward prematurely, leaning on circumstantial impressions, incomplete witness interpretation, or assumptions that hadn't been legally locked down, they would have risked something far worse than a delay. They would have risked finality, because an acquittal doesn't just fail to deliver justice, it prevents it. Double jeopardy is not an abstract concept. It is a hard stop. Once a jury clears someone, that door closes, and it closes forever, at least in the United States. Double jeopardy is a one and done. You are done.
Yeah.
No matter what new evidence appears later. Like, have you seen the movie with Ashley Judd? That is very much real.
Yeah, you can finally say yes to a movie question you've asked.
Yeah, like if you are freaking found not guilty, if you were acquitted of that crime, you literally can go out and kill that person in broad daylight. They're no doubtably going to charge you with shit.
Yeah.
But they cannot charge you with murder.
They'll find something else.
You have already been found innocent. It is a very real thing. And that reality shaped every decision in Dana's case. Investigators were not deciding whether they wanted an arrest. They were deciding whether an arrest would survive a defense attorney whose job would be to dismantle every weak link, every assumption, every leap made before the evidence was ready. And there were weak links, not because the case was thin, but because the legal system demanded more than just belief. Eyewitness testimony, while powerful, is vulnerable. Composite sketches are investigative tools, but they are not proof. Fingerprints without a database hit establish presence, but not identity. And DNA without a lawful comparator is functionally an orphan. So when the case slowed, when it happened to stall, it wasn't because investigators had run out of ideas. It is because they had run out of safe moves. From the outside, the case looked frozen, but from inside, it was being handled like something fragile, because it was. Every new tip had to be evaluated against what it actually added, not what it promised emotionally. Every name had to be weighed against whether it could be lawfully tied to the evidence that's already been preserved. And most importantly, every action had to be measured against what would happen in court, not in the headlines. That's where the disconnect with the public began to widen, because People assume investigations fail when nothing is happening, when in reality, investigations often fail when too much happens too soon. And Dana's case existed right on that fault line. Time is usually framed as the enemy in unsolved cases, but sometimes time is the only thing that allows a case to survive. As months turned into years, one thing remained constant in Dana's case. The evidence was preserved. It wasn't degraded. It wasn't discarded. It wasn't lost to procedural shortcuts. That was not accidental. Investigators understood that science evolves, databases expand, legal standards shift. What isn't usable today might become decisive tomorrow if it's protected. Waiting wasn't about hoping something would magically change. It was about making sure that when something did change, the case was still intact enough to respond. That kind of patience doesn't look heroic. It doesn't generate headlines, and it doesn't satisfy people who want immediate closure. But it's often the only way a case like this survives long enough to be solved at all.
So when people say the case went cold, what they're really seeing is a case being kept intact until the system catches up.
Yes, exactly. Cold doesn't always mean abandoned. Sometimes it means restrained. And in Dana Satterfield's case, restraint was the only thing standing between uncertainty and a permanent miscarriage of justice, because the evidence that mattered most was already there. It just wasn't allowed to speak yet. At this point in the story, nothing dramatic has happened. That's when cases like this start attracting attention beyond their borders. Media interest, television exposure, tip lines lighting up, a surge of people convinced they finally recognize something that they missed before. Not because the facts have changed, but because the silence has become unbearable. And that's the moment where patience is tested hardest, because outside pressure doesn't just increase visibility, it increases the risk of getting it wrong. And in Dana Satterfield's case, the years of restraint were about to collide with something powerful, unpredictable, and emotionally charged: national attention. And with it, the most dangerous promise an unsolved case can offer: the feeling that the answer is finally close. When a case reaches national attention, it doesn't just get louder, it gets heavier. Every unsolved case carries two parallel realities: the one investigators live in, governed by evidence and law, and the one the public lives in, shaped by narrative and emotion. When media enters the picture, those two realities collide, and rarely is it clean. When Dana's case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the response was immediate. Tips poured in, phones rang. People who had never heard of Roebuck, South Carolina, suddenly felt connected to the story. For Dana's family, it felt like hope. For investigators, it felt like pressure. And for the case itself, it was about to feel like movement, even though the ground beneath it hadn't actually changed. One of the most difficult things to explain to the public is that attention is not the same thing as progress. When tips surge, investigators don't suddenly get closer to the truth by default. They get busier, louder, more crowded. Every call has to be logged, every claim evaluated, every lead chased just far enough to confirm whether it adds something or subtracts from clarity. Most don't add anything, but occasionally one does. And that's where this case took a turn that felt briefly like resolution. A man came onto law enforcement's radar who seemed to check too many boxes to ignore. His name surfaced through the noise with just enough substance to demand attention. He resembled the composite sketch. He had a history of violence against women. He had access to a vehicle very similar to the one described near the scene. And most compelling of all, he was alleged, through a jailhouse source, to have confessed. Jailhouse confessions carry a strange power in the public imagination. They feel raw and unfiltered, like truth slipping out when someone thinks they have nothing left to lose. But in reality, they are among the most unreliable forms of evidence that's available. People in custody lie for leverage. They lie for attention. They lie to reduce their own exposure, and they lie because someone else puts the idea in their head. That doesn't mean jailhouse information is automatically discarded, but it does mean it must be verified independently, ruthlessly. In this case, investigators did exactly that. They didn't dismiss the lead, and they didn't embrace it. They ran it through the one filter that doesn't care about narrative, emotion, or timing, and that was science. The man who briefly became the focus of renewed attention, he looked right on paper. Even an eyewitness, when presented with a photo lineup, identified him. That detail alone should unsettle anyone who believes certainty is simple. Eyewitness identification feels definitive until it isn't. Because memory, even though we think it does not replay like a video. It reconstructs. And reconstruction is vulnerable to suggestion, expectation, and time. This is why investigators didn't stop at identification. They went to the lab. The preserved biological evidence that had been waiting quietly since 1995 was finally compared, and it excluded him completely. The DNA did not match. No ambiguity, no statistical gray area, no room for reinterpretation. The man everyone was ready to believe was responsible, the man whose story felt like it fit, was scientifically eliminated. And just like that, the case snapped back to where it had been before the spotlight turned on. Only now, the cost was higher. It's tempting to view this chapter as a setback and wasted time, false hope, a detour that delayed justice. But that's not what it was. This moment mattered because it clarified something essential. The preserved evidence worked. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. It excluded the wrong person before the system could make an irreversible mistake. That's how cases like this start attracting theories that have nothing to do with evidence. Nonsense like professional hits, organized crime, out-of-town predators who vanished without a trace. The problem wasn't imagination, it was displacement. When the real explanation refuses to surface, people invent some whacked out shit that feel more satisfying than uncertainty. And I mean, this whole professional hit, organized crime angle of this case is whacked out shit. But the evidence in Dana's case never suggested sophistication. It never suggested planning at any level. It suggested something far more uncomfortable, an ordinary offender, local, blended into daily life, invisible until the moment that he wasn't. That idea is much harder to live with.
So when that lead collapsed, it didn't just take a suspect off the table, it made the truth feel even harder to accept.
100%, because the closer people thought they were to an answer, the more unsettling it became when the answer slipped away. And yet, this moment did something else that wouldn't be obvious until much later. It cleared the ground. By eliminating someone who looked right but wasn't, the case shed one more layer of noise, one more false shape, one more distraction. What remained was quieter and closer to the truth. After the media attention receded, Dana Satterfield's case returned to that uncomfortable middle space. Still open, still active, still constrained. The evidence was intact. The wrong man had been ruled out, and investigators were back where they'd been before, but with one critical difference. They now knew with absolute certainty what the case was not. And sometimes that's the most important step forward a case can take, because when enough false doors close, the remaining one doesn't look like hope, it looks like inevitability. And that inevitability was waiting, not for new technology, not for a lucky break, but on a human decision that had not yet been made, a decision that would finally give investigators the legal doorway they had been waiting for all along. There's a particular kind of tip that haunts long-running investigations. Not the frantic ones, not the elaborate ones, not the ones filled with certainty or with accusation. It's the quiet ones. The calls where the voice hesitates, where details are offered carefully and selectively, where the caller knows something but not enough, or not safely enough to put their name behind it. Anonymous tips sit in a strange space in law enforcement. They're not meaningless, but they're not actionable either. From the outside, it's easy to say, if someone keeps calling in about the same person, why not just act? Because acting requires ownership. Anonymous information has no anchor. There's no witness to cross-examine. There's no statement to authenticate. There's no way to test credibility under oath. Investigators can't build probable cause in a voice with no name. They can listen, they can document, they can quietly compare the information against what they already know, but they cannot force the next step. In Dana's case, these anonymous voices didn't contradict the evidence, they aligned with it. And that alignment is what made them so unsettling. Inside the sheriff's office, these anonymous tips weren't ignored. They were logged, they were cross-referenced. They were compared to existing timelines, witness observations, and known behaviors. Patterns were noted, not conclusions. That distinction matters because investigators understood that anonymous information could become powerful only if it eventually gained a name, only if someone was willing to stand behind it. Until then, it was like having a locked door with a keyhole, close enough to see through but impossible to open. And they waited. Not passively, not casually. They waited because they had to, because pushing an anonymous voice into the spotlight too soon doesn't create truth, it destroys credibility.
So the case wasn't really waiting on technology or time, it was waiting on courage.
That's exactly it. The system had done what it could do. The evidence was preserved, the wrong people had been ruled out, the right person hadn't been legally reachable, not because he was invisible, but because someone who could make him visible wasn't ready yet. And until that changed, the case stayed exactly where it was, balanced on the edge between silence and revelation. By the early 2000s, Dana's case existed in a tense equilibrium. Not cold, not solved, not forgotten, just waiting. Waiting for the moment when fear finally outweighed silence, when responsibility eclipsed self-preservation, when an anonymous voice decided it was time to stop whispering. And when that happened, everything investigators had been holding in place, every preserved piece of evidence, every documented lead, every careful decision not to act too soon, would finally matter. Because the case had never been missing its truth. It had been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Dana's case lingered in the background of lives that continued to unfold. Marriages, divorces, children, jobs, relocations. And with every change, the emotional calculus of silence shifted. The question stopped being, can I live with this? And slowly became, can I keep living like this? That's not something investigators can force, but they can prepare for it. The quiet years weren't passive, they were deliberate. Evidence was maintained, records preserved, procedures updated to ensure that when, not if, something changed, the case wouldn't have to be rebuilt from scratch. That kind of waiting is invisible to the public, but it's the difference between a case that survives long enough to be solved and one that doesn't. Dana's case survived.
So all those years, the case wasn't stalled. It was being held in place until someone else was ready to move.
That's exactly right. The system can only move as fast as the truth allows. And in this case, the truth wasn't hidden in a lab result or a database. It was sitting inside a person who wasn't ready to speak yet.
So this wasn't the moment the case was solved. It was the moment it finally became solvable.
Exactly. This is the difference between having answers and being able to use them. At this point in the story, nothing has been announced publicly. There's no headlines yet, no arrests, no press conferences, but the case has shifted. The silence has broken its most important rule, anonymity. What comes next is not speculation or waiting. It's process, legal process, evidentiary process, a reckoning built on patience rather than impulse. And that reckoning is coming because once a voice gets a name, the system no longer has to wait. It can finally move. When silence finally breaks, it rarely does so loudly. And in Dana's case, that shift began when Michael Anthony Pace stepped forward, not as the killer, but as the witness who could no longer carry what he knew. Pace's decision didn't end the case. It unlocked it. Because once he attached his name to what had previously lived in anonymity, investigators finally had what they'd been waiting for, a lawful bridge between preserved evidence and a specific person. That person was Jonathan Vick. Once Pace formally provided his statement, investigators did not rush. They verified. Statements were documented and cross-checked. Timelines were aligned. Behavioral details were measured against what had been preserved since 1995. And then came the comparison that mattered the most. The biological evidence recovered from the scene, the evidence that had been waiting quietly for more than a decade, was lawfully compared to Jonathan Vick. This time, science did not exclude. It matched. The DNA profile was consistent. The uncertainty collapsed. The case moved from suspicion to proof. Dana Satterfield's murder finally had a name attached to it. Not through rumor, not through pressure, but through admissible forensic fact.
So all that waiting, all that restraint wasn't a failure of the system. It was the system doing exactly what it was supposed to do.
Exactly. The hardest thing for people to accept is that justice doesn't move at the speed of grief, fear, or expectation. It moves at the speed of proof, and proof cannot be rushed without being damaged. There's a particular kind of discomfort that comes from knowing the truth exists and yet can't be used. It isn't the chaos of having nothing. It isn't the panic of uncertainty. It's the tension of proximity. In Dana Satterfield's case, investigators weren't lost. They weren't improvising. They weren't hoping something would magically appear. They were standing in front of a locked door with the evidence in hand, waiting for the law to allow them to turn the key. That's part of the justice most people never see. We're conditioned to believe that once DNA exists, action should follow, that once suspicion narrows, inevitability takes over. But the law doesn't operate on inevitability. It operates on thresholds. And during the years this case remained open but unmoving, those thresholds mattered more than pressure, more than headlines, more than frustration. Because acting too soon doesn't just risk error, it risks finality. An arrest without lawful foundation becomes an acquittal, and an acquittal becomes permanence, and permanence is something a cold case cannot survive. So investigators waited. They preserved evidence instead of forcing conclusions. They documented instead of speculating. They ruled out the wrong man instead of convincing themselves that he was right. And when the moment finally came, when a witness stepped forward and a lawful comparison could be made, the case was ready. That readiness is what secured accountability. Not urgency, not public pressure, not narrative certainty, restraint. For Dana's family, those years were not abstract. They were lived, measured in holidays and in silence and in unanswered questions. But the case did not collapse under that weight. It endured because someone understood that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it is justice protected long enough to be delivered correctly. Dana Satterfield did not receive speed. She received certainty. And certainty is harder to achieve, but it lasts. Before we move any further, we need to pause. This episode has been about time, about waiting, restraint, and the uncomfortable space between knowing and proving. It's been about systems, decisions, and the silence that surrounded this case for years. But this moment is different. This is not about evidence, it's not about suspects, and it's not about understanding violence. This is about stepping away from the investigation long enough to remember the person at the center of it. the life that existed before everything narrowed to a single night. Dana Satterfield was not defined by how she died or by where she was found. She was a mother, a business owner, a woman who built her days around responsibility, routine, and care for her children, for her clients, and for the community that she was a part of. Her life was shaped by ordinary comments, by showing up, by trust, by the quiet confidence that comes from building something stable in a place that feels familiar and safe. As part of how we honor Dana, we're continuing our collaboration with the J.J. Hawk Band, whose music we use intentionally during select victim tributes. Their work, produced through Hawk Studios, is not meant to guide interpretation or to heighten emotion. It's meant to sit quietly alongside remembrance. The song you're about to hear is the same one that we chose to honor Dana in episode 1. In multi-episode cases, we don't change the music because the tribute isn't about the episode, it's about the person. The song is called Under Glass Skies. It carries a sense of fragility, the feeling of moving through everyday spaces where danger isn't supposed to exist, of being visible, present, and unguarded, of living inside routines that feel protective until suddenly they aren't. As the music plays beneath the tribute, we ask you to listen gently, not to the crime, not to the investigation, and not to the questions that come later, but to who Dana was. A woman balancing motherhood, work, and independence, still imagining what tomorrow would bring. This is Under Glass Skies by the J.J. Hawk Band. And this is Dana Satterfield. Dana Satterfield lived in a life built on familiarity, not spectacle, not risk, familiarity. Her days followed patterns that made sense, schedules shaped by work, children, responsibility, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing where you're supposed to be and who depends on you. She owned a business that required trust, the kind of trust that grows slowly, client by client, conversation by conversation, the kind that assumes safety without having to name it. Her salon wasn't just a place of work, it was part of her routine, part of her independence, part of how she provided for her family. Dana was a mother first. Everything else fit around that. Her life wasn't defined by grand gestures or dramatic turns. It was defined by showing up, by consistency, by the unremarkable strength it takes to balance care for others with the demands of building something for yourself. That's what makes what happened to her so difficult to reconcile, because Dana didn't disappear into danger. She didn't walk into a place that felt wrong. She didn't live a life shaped by fear. She moved through ordinary spaces, the kinds of spaces that we all trust without thinking, believing that tomorrow would arrive the way it always had. And for a long time after her death, that belief lingered in the absence that she left behind. Her children grew older without answers. Her family learned how to live with a story that stopped mid-sentence. And the place where she spent so many of her days became a reminder not just of loss, but of interruption. Dana's life wasn't meant to be reduced to a case file, or a timeline, or a question mark that waited years to be resolved. She was a woman in motion, making plans, meeting responsibilities, imagining what came next. That's the part of her story that time can't erase, because while investigations measure evidence and law measures proof, memory measures something else entirely. It measures presence. Dana's presence lived in the routines that she kept, in the work that she built, in the children she loved, in the quiet expectation that life would continue in predictable ways. And that expectation mattered. It mattered because it reminds us of who Dana was before violence narrowed her story, before her name became attached to waiting and silence and unanswered years. Tonight, as this music plays beneath her memory, we don't ask you to make sense of what happened to her. We ask you to remember that Dana's life was larger than the moment that it ended, larger than evidence that waited, larger than silence that followed, larger than the time it took for the truth to arrive. She was a mother, a business owner, a woman living an ordinary life and expecting it to continue. Dana Satterfield deserved that future, and remembering her means holding on to the life that she was living, not just the loss that came after it. Before we wrap up, we want to take a moment to tell you how you can get involved beyond listening. If you want to support real-world action, check out the Dark Dialogue Collective. This is not a donation tier, it's boots-on-the-ground work. Physical searches, victim advocacy, family support, and direct action when help is needed the most.
You can also visit www.darkdialogue.com to learn more about our Adopt a Victim program. This program focuses exclusively on unresolved cases. You can adopt a victim and help research their story, work to identify unnamed victims, or assist in uncovering information about those responsible when justice hasn't yet been served.
On the website, you'll also find our victim blog posts where we document cases, preserve names, and keep these stories accessible and searchable so they aren't lost to time. If you'd like to support the show financially, we offer a few options. For recurring support, visit patreon.com/darkdialoguepod. For one-time support, you can go to Ko-fi, that's ko-fi.com/darkdialogue.
You can also follow our long-form writing and case updates on Substack at darkdialoguecrime.substack.com. If you have case information, questions, or want to reach out directly, you can email us at info@darkdialogue.com.
Dark Dialogue is part of a growing network of shows. Be sure to check out Dark Dialogue Rocky Mountain Reckoning, Distilled, Unraveled Truths, Gallows and Gunfights, and of course, Shadow Chat Sessions.
And wherever you're listening or watching, please take a moment to like, share, leave a review, subscribe, give us a thumbs up, and ring the bell. The small actions make a real difference in visibility and helps these cases reach more people.
Watch out for yourselves and each other. Keep listening, keep sharing, stay vigilant, and keep the dialogue alive.